This is a route that I was holding off getting for as long as possible, for one main reason that I will explain later. Despite being something very significant, the first and currently only French route in TSW, it is still a massive letdown. Today I'm reviewing the LGV Méditerranée Marseille to Avignon route, and I apologise in advance for any butchered French pronunciations. Towards the end of May 2023, Dovetail made this route free of charge to celebrate their acquisition by Focus Entertainment, which is apparently a French company. Normally it costs 37 New Zealand dollars, which I think is too high a price for such a linear route with no service variation. I wouldn't have bothered picking this route up if it wasn't for the free offer. The reason why I was so hesitant to pick up this add-on is because it makes no sense to me. It is just a remake of the Marseille to Avignon route we've already got in TS Classic, but at least that version eventually got extended all the way to Lyon, while the TSW version is cut at Avignon yet again. This route is 58 miles long, and while that's decent by TSW standards, it only takes half an hour to complete. The included motive power is exactly the same as it was last time, just the TGV Duplex and nothing else. Except this time, we get the grey and white, with a dash of pink, Carmillon livery, instead of the standard SNCF blue and grey. So basically, all Dovetail did with remaking this add-on was change the livery and update the route to a more recent time period. Yeah, there was an old roundhouse in Marseille on the original route, but that's now gone. While this train can travel at up to 320 km per hour, and that's quite an impressive speed, that is spoiled by just how little time it takes to cover the full route, and the train feels like a caged animal. The problem with only including one train, aside from the journeys feeling predictable and repetitive, is that the route is too empty. Especially at Marseille-Saint-Charles, the southern end of the route, which just looks and feels wrong when only 2 or 3 tracks are occupied at any one time. In real life, it is the 11th busiest station in France. I don't understand why Dovetail chose to remake the existing Marseille to Avignon route, of all things, for TSW, instead of at least considering the masses of other interesting railway lines all throughout France. That one that you see in the video by the Tim Traveller, where he visits the least used station in France, would probably be a better choice than this bland high-speed route that we already have in a previous game. As if the route being too linear wasn't bad enough, there are only 3 stations on it. Yes, that's right. Between Marseille-Saint-Charles and Avignon, there is just one intermediate stop at Aix-en-Provence. This isn't Dovetail's fault, of course, but it is their fault for choosing such a questionable route concept. I don't know how realistic the schedule is, but the timetable mode is still one of the weakest I've ever seen in this game. You only get a measly 52 services in the entire 24-hour schedule, with 8 of them being empty stock moves in Marseille. And I thought Spirit of Steam was the definition of a Spartan timetable. 44 of those timetable mode services are actual passenger runs, 22 northbound and 22 southbound. While there is that equal number of services in both directions, the headways are really inconsistent, with trains running anywhere from 5 minutes to 2 hours and 16 minutes apart. It only takes 29 to 35 minutes to cover this whole 58-mile long route, which kind of defeats the point of this DLC, especially since there's sod all that you can do here. Cathcart Circle, despite having similarly short journey times, is a better route than Marseille to Avignon because you at least get a good amount of service variation on this route. Not to mention the fact that this one is non-linear. Besides the poor timetable mode, you also get a tutorial for the TGV Duplex and a quintet of scenarios. The tutorial has a decent amount of detail on how to set up and drive this train, but it does not go into any detail about how the classic signals work out of Marseille-Saint-Charles, let alone the TVM 430 in-cab signalling on the high-speed section, and I don't know anything about French signalling. Why do tutorials in TSW always leave out instructions on how the signals work? The TGV Duplex kind of suffers from the same problem as a few German electric locomotives in this game, where you have to walk through part of the interior to access the cab, but an invisible wall prevents you from walking down the whole corridor. In the TGV's case, it's even worse, because there's just this black void of nothing past the invisible wall. While the route that Dovetail provided in this add-on is still way too short for a train this fast, the line itself is still interesting, in a way. The initial section out of Marseille actually has you running on part of the older classic lines, which are electrified on 1500 volts DC, while the high-speed line is on 25 kV AC, and you pass through a couple of disused stations on the way. I also like how you can briefly see the sea as you approach the start of the long tunnel leading onto the high-speed section. And at least you've also got the voltage change process to make the driving experience a little bit more interesting. But unlike the Class 395 Javelins, which change power modes while they're stopped in a station, the TGVs have to switch while they're still moving. This means that, for a very brief moment, your train will just be cruising along with all the pantographs down. An unusual aspect of this line is that the gradients can get pretty steep, up to around 1 in 29 at the steepest. This is normal for the LGV lines, as the trains travel so fast that the steep inclines aren't much of a burden. But because of the constant dipping up and down over these hills, you need to be careful with the throttle and brake levers so that you don't break the speed limit. At speeds higher than 200 km per hour, normal colour light signals would flash by too quickly for the driver to read and react to them. This is why the LGV lines use TVM 430 in-cab signalling, the same type that's used by Class 373, 374 and 395 units on High Speed 1. I won't comment on most of the sounds, due to my non-existent knowledge of the real thing, but I will say that the horn sounds funny. And it reminds me of the Deutsche Bahn BR403 or ICE 3. Interestingly, you will hear one long and low beep from the doors as they close, rather than several short beeps heard on units like the BR422 or Class 484. I remember hearing a similar low tone in footage of the Paris Metro EMUs, or was it the rolling stock on the Berlin U-Bahn? But either way, I didn't think the TGV would have the same setup. The brakes on this thing are not what I expected from a modern high-speed train. It is a spring-loaded setup where you have to hold the lever in its apply position for a certain amount of time depending on how hard you want the brakes to be applied. It works the same way when you want to release the brakes, and this threw me off for the first few times I tried it. While it's exciting to be able to thrash along at up to 320 km per hour, this is somewhat spoiled by the bland terrain north of Aix-en-Provence. Most of the route runs through an undeveloped rural landscape, and I think Avignon is a terrible place to end the route because it is not a big station, let alone a grand terminus like Marseille-Saint-Charles. The route should have been extended to Lyon, or, at the very least, Valence. I wasn't at all surprised to see that there's missing overhead wires just outside Marseille-Saint-Charles, and that Dovetail still hasn't bothered to fix such a fundamental error here and on at least 4 other routes. There's the usual issue of flat grass textures with no proper foliage detail, which is present in several spots throughout the route, and I'm not surprised at all to see it again. This is a pet peeve of mine because, even though you won't notice it when you're speeding along in the TGV Duplex, Knowing that it's there still gives me the impression that the development of this route was rushed. Before I end the video, I want to suggest that Dovetail make lines A and C of the Lyon Metro as a future add-on. If licensing issues with TCL are a hassle, they could just use the plain orange livery that the MPL 75 and MCL 80 trains used to carry, even though I think that livery is ugly. I've gone into more detail about these lines, and the history of the MCL 80 train in a previous video. If you still like the Marseille to Avignon add-on, that's fine by me. And in the words of Brett Cooper, I don't care if somebody disagrees with me, we're all allowed to have different opinions. Despite my criticisms against this add-on, it still offers a rare break from the UK, US and Germany trends that the devs always focus on. I just wish that we could get some more, and better, French routes in the future, or even just an extra train as an add-on for the existing route. Something like the single-decker TGV Réseau would be fine with me, especially since they could just do that in the same Carmillon livery that we've already got.